Okay, Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It's an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed "This schedule in effect July 5th, 1922, but I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. Real quickly, I think it's important to note that no one does know anything about Gatsby, and so when he was listening to that conversation between the ladies talking about how he's a bootlegger, or he's nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil, all those are just rumors. Nobody really knows anything. However, there are plenty of people who come to Gatsby's parties and enjoy his hospitality, and still they'll, spread those rumors, and they really don't know anything, but they'll accept his hospitality. I'm not going to actually read this next section, so we're going to skip down a little bit, but you can read it if you want. But basically, it's just a list of different people who did exactly that. They accepted Gatsby's hospitality without really knowing much about them. So there's all sorts of details here about people, and I underlined a couple that I thought were interesting. There's this guy who was drowned. There's another guy who had a fight with a bum named Eddie in the garden. Another guy who went to the actually the same guy went to the penitentiary so drunk on the gravel drive that he ended up, his right hand got run over. There's all these different people. Another guy, Rock Gut Ferret, came to gamble. He got cleaned out. There's a guy that they just called the Border. So all of these random people. But then what I noticed about a lot of these things that I was underlining is all of these people are kind of tragic or pathetic, right? There's this guy who went to Gatsby's party and he later killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. So there's all these people that just kind of have these weird, random, but also kind of sad and tragic details, which maybe suggests the state of the people in this area. And then the emotional state or the psychological state of these people, that they all kind of seem miserable or kind of low down. Okay. So I'm going to skip. Oh yeah. See again, more details that I underlined, but I'm going to skip down to the bottom of page 63, where I'm going to continue on. So that was just kind of, like I said, a list of people who came to Gatsby's party. Now let's continue on. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and, at his urgent invitation, made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, and that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickels, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, and with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. Those of you studying Gatsby, this would be a really, really great section to take a look at, because as I've mentioned before, we know about characters in a number of different ways, sometimes because of what they say or what they do or what other people say about them, but sometimes also because of the objects that belong to them or that are associated with them. We did a little study on Gatsby's house and how that showed something about him, or Nick's house showed something about him. So now here we have this description of Gatsby's car, and so if I were a Gatsby person, I'd maybe take a little closer look at that. Okay, but I'm going to keep going for now. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression was that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began, leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase, "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. So it is kind of important to note that now Gatsby is telling you from his own mouth, this is his background, this is where I came from, this is what's important about me. Specifically, we learned some things. He says, I'm educated at Oxford, I'm from the Midwest, I'm the son of wealthy people, I was educated at Oxford because everybody in my family is educated at Oxford. And so he says all of these details, and it's coming straight from the horse's mouth, right? He's saying them. But does Nick believe him? No, right? He says, now I understand why Jordan Baker doesn't believe him about the Oxford thing, right? It says he choked on it. He said it so fast. I was educated at Oxford. It's almost like he wanted to get it out so fast because it's almost like he didn't believe it, right? And then notice it says, with this doubt. The second I kind of heard that phrase hurried in a weird way, with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces. And now Nick is really skeptical, right? Yeah, now finally we're hearing some details about Gatsby from Gatsby himself, and yet we don't believe it. Nick doesn't believe it, and so therefore we kind of don't believe it either. All right, so Nick asks, well, what part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. Okay, is San Francisco in the Midwest? The answer is no. San Francisco is on the West Coast, so that's kind of weird. If you say I'm from the Midwest and you say I'm from San Francisco, doesn't line up, right? Someone from the Midwest would be like, that's not Midwest, right? My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that, I lived like a young Rajah in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character, leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. All right, so again, Nick is not buying anything that's coming out of Gatsby's mouth, but realistically, look at what is coming out of Gatsby's mouth. He says, I lived like a young Rajah, and I traveled all over Europe. A young Rajah would be like a prince, right? And so I went all over Europe. I was like a prince, and I was, just doing normal things, like collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, which, again, not so normal, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself. This all does sound, like Nick says later, it's like he's a character, like he had, it's not really authentically a real person, like this must be some, fantastic character from a book, like nobody actually lives like that, that can't be real, and that's what Nick says. But Gatsby continues on. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine-gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Louis guns, and when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration, even Montenegro, little Montenegro, down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. All right, so again, remember incredulity is like this, this disbelief. Nick is not buying what Gatsby's selling. Earlier, he said, well, for a while I lived like a prince and I was collecting rubies and da-da-da-da-da. And now all of a sudden, he's become this war hero. And so again, from Gatsby's mouth, he's like, well, yeah, I was a war hero. And I basically almost single-handedly took down 3 divisions of the German army and da-da-da-da. And yeah, even Montenegro gave me a little medal for it. And you're like, how could this possibly all be true? Like, it can't all be true. There's no person that could possibly live all of these lives in just a short amount of time. And here it says it was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines, right? If you think about what a magazine is, it's a highlight of different people's stories, right? If you look at a magazine, it's not, a magazine is not about one person. It's about multiple people, and it's all their different stories, all the highlights, all the cool things that are going on, all the greatest fashion of this person and the great adventure of that person. And so he's like, listening to Gatsby talk about himself was like skimming through a magazine, right? There's no way this could possibly be true, but it's fascinating, right? But here we go. He just said he's a war hero. Now, he reached in his pocket and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordere de Danilo ran the circular legend, Montenegro, Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of 6 young men in blazers loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson-lighted depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. Okay, so earlier Nick was not buying what Gatsby was selling because it sounded totally ridiculous. But now Gatsby has proof, right? He pulls out a medal. He's like, here's the medal from Montenegro. So I really was a war hero, right? And then he pulls out a picture. He's like, here's a picture of me at Oxford. So, okay, so he did go to Oxford, right? So Nick is like, all right, well, I guess if these details are true, I guess everything else is true. But we as a reader, we should have a question here. At least I certainly have a question here. My question is, does Gatsby normally just carry around his war medal and a random picture of himself at Oxford? Like, that's a weird thing to carry around. Like, I went to college and I went to APU, a university. Do I have it on my wall? Sure. Okay. It's over there, Azusa Pacific, right? But I don't carry around a picture of myself standing in front of APU. That's kind of a weird thing to carry, especially considering we have cell phones for stuff like that. But still, that's a weird thing to carry. And do people normally carry around their medals with them in their pocket? No, right? So this is kind of weird, and I kind of question, like, is this some sort of a setup? Like, why would you carry that around, right? These are weird things to carry around, okay? I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? Oh, no, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby, and I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. Okay, so Gatsby explains why he has these things. He's like, well, I brought these things because I wanted to, make sure that you trust me because I'm going to make a big request of you today. I don't know if you guys feel it, but it's really annoying when somebody's like, yeah, I'm going to ask you an important question later. And you're like, why not just ask me now? And he's like, no, later. That's really annoying, right? And Nick is extra annoyed because he's like, why do you have to talk to me through Jordan Baker? Why not just talk to me? Right? So Nick is a little bit annoyed at this point. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria. Only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. "All right, old sport," called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. "Right you are," agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. "Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me." "What was that?" I inquired. "The picture of Oxford?" "I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year." Okay, again, another weird random thing that Gatsby pulls out of his wallet. Some random white card, we don't know what's on it, but he was going to get pulled over by a policeman. He shows it to the policeman, and all of a sudden the policeman's like, "Oh, yep, my bad." Okay, now that doesn't happen to normal people. I don't know what exactly this suggests, but hey, he says I was able to do the police commissioner, a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. There's some sort of kind of sketchy implication there, right? Like doing the commissioner a favor. What kind of a favor do you need to do for a police officer or a police commissioner, right? It could suggest some sort of corruption as well. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks, and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen, without any particular wonder. I just wanted to point out 2 things. First of all, bottom of page 68, Nick is enthralled with New York City. He's enthralled with this lifestyle. He says there's something so incredible about the Queensboro Bridge seen for the first time, right? There's this promise of mystery and beauty in the world. So he is enthralled, and we've seen that before. He talks about how he's enchanted by this New York City lifestyle, right? And so here's another example of him being enchanted by that. And then also he is enchanted by the promise of anything can happen in New York City. He notices a car that is being driven by a white chauffeur with black people in the back, right? And that's when he comments, anything can happen. Remember, this is the 1920s. This would have been a time when that would have been an unexpected scene, right? So he unexpectedly sees this scene of a white chauffeur with black passengers, and he goes, wow, anything can happen, right? And so New York City is this place where anything can happen, anything at all. Continuing on. Roaring noon. In a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. "Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim." A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Catspa, and I said, "All right, Catspa, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth." He shut it then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. Okay, at this point, we should be thinking of our first impression of Mr. Wolfsheim, right? Look at what he says. I handed the money to Catspa and I said, all right, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. That's an interesting phrase, till he shuts his mouth, and he shut it then and there. I don't know what your impressions are of this guy yet, but I don't know. Be thinking it doesn't sound like a very nice person, let's say. All right, let's keep going. "Highballs?" asked the waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling, "but I like across the street better." "Yes, highballs," agreed Gatsby, and then to Mr. Wolfsheim, "It's too hot over there." "Well, hot and small, yes," said Mr. Wolfsheim, "but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole," said Gatsby. The old metropole, brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily, filled with faces dead and gone, filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says somebody wants to speak to him outside. All right, says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled him down in his chair. Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you so help me move outside this room. It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. Did he go? I asked innocently. Well, sure he went. Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, Don't let that waiter take away my coffee. Then he went out on the sidewalk, and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. Oh, 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becker. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. I understand you're looking for a business connection. Let's pause real quickly. That story where he says, oh, that old metropole, it's full of memories. It's almost like he's thinking back fondly of these memories. But then he tells a story about how this guy got shot, right? Most likely involved in organized crime because he knew that the guy was going to get shot, right? People were there waiting to shoot him, and he goes out and he gets shot. Okay, so he has this like fond memory of this, which suggests something about Mr. Wolfsheim too, that if this is the kind of guy that would have a fond memory of that type of deal. Okay, so then Mr. Wolfsheim, he turns to Nick and he says, I understand you're looking for a business connection. And then Nick says, the juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. When he says juxtaposition, that means side by side, right? So he had just told about a very good friend of his, probably a business connection of his, that got shot. And so he says, yeah, I have this story about this friend of mine, this person that was in a business connection with me that got shot. Hey, do you want to be in a business connection with me? And so that remark, the side by side of those 2 remarks was kind of startling to him. Gatsby answered for me. Oh no, he exclaimed, this isn't the man. No? Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I had the wrong man. Okay, first of all, I love that Gatsby was somewhat protective of Nick, trying to keep Nick away from a business connection with Mr. Wolfsheim. But that also suggests that Gatsby knows that this is maybe not a good situation for Nick. And if that's the case, then, and Gatsby knows that, then what does that suggest about Gatsby? Gatsby's in the know. Ooh. A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that, except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered. I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing underhand, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't all right. Which, of course, is ironic because there was a story about her possibly cheating and paying people off. So that's a little ironic there. She'd never do anything that wasn't all right. Suddenly he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman. Yes. He's an Oxford man. Oh. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College. Yeah, I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Well, have you known Gatsby for a long time? I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. Now I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah. He flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. I've enjoyed my lunch, he said, and I'm going to run off from you 2 young men before I outstay my welcome. Don't hurry, Meyer, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hand in a sort of benediction. "You're very polite, but I belong to another generation," he announced solemnly. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your—" He supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. "As for me, I'm 50 years old and I won't impose myself on you any longer." As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes," explained Gatsby. "This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway." "Who is he, anyhow? An actor?" "No." "A dentist?" "Meyer Wolfsheim?" "No, he's a gambler." I just wanted to comment. I love his question of, is he a dentist, right? Because Nick is like, he's kind of an innocent guy, and he's hoping this guy is a dentist, because why the heck else would this guy have, what do you call them? What they call it? Cuff buttons of human molars, right? So I love that Nick is like, I hope he's a dentist, because otherwise that's super weird, right? But no, it says Meyer Wolfsheim. No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly, "He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. "Fixed the World Series?" I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. "How did he happen to do that?" I asked after a minute. "Just saw an opportunity." "Well, why isn't he in jail?" "They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man." Okay, again, I love the innocence that Nick shows here, that, like, if he would have thought of, somebody fixing the World Series, it's just a thing that happened. Nick couldn't imagine the lack of integrity it would take, or the amount of lying and cheating it would take to cheat that many people out of it, and 50 million people, right? And so Nick is just kind of on the innocent end of things there, okay? I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. So here comes Tom. "Oh, come along with me for a minute," I said. "I've got to say hello to someone." When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. "Where have you been?" he demanded eagerly. Daisy's furious because you haven't called up." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan." They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. "Well, how have you been, anyhow?" demanded Tom of me. "How'd you happen to come up this far to eat?" "Well, I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby." I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. Okay, a couple things before we move on to the next section here. This is a really awkward interaction between Gatsby and Tom and Nick. Nick is not thinking anything of it, but it is kind of interesting that Tom doesn't really even acknowledge Gatsby. He's like, I don't really care about that person. I only care to talk to Nick. But then it says there's an unfamiliar, strained look of embarrassment over Gatsby's face. And then when Nick turns to look at Gatsby again, Gatsby is gone. So there is a level of discomfort here, right? And the only other thing I want to mention is that back earlier, when Nick was sitting alone with Meyer Wolfsheim was saying all sorts of nice things, right? That's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. Or Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife, right? Why is he saying all of these nice things? Well, it could just be that Meyer Wolfsheim really likes Gatsby and is trying to talk him up. Or it could be that Gatsby is has told Meyer Wolfsheim to talk him up to Nick, right? Because earlier, it says when he was asking about the business connection, he says, no, this is just a friend. I told you to talk about that some other time. I had the wrong man, right? So it seems like Gatsby and Wolfsheim have a different arrangement to talk to a different person about business. Why is it so unheard of to think that maybe Gatsby brought him to meet Meyer Wolfsheim so that Meyer Wolfsheim could then vouch for his good character, right? But then that begs the question, why does Gatsby need someone to vouch for his good character? What would that suggest about him, right? Okay, moving on to a change of scene here, okay? So this is completely different. This is going to be a scene where we learn a lot about Daisy's backstory and kind of where she came from, how we ended up in this situation, or she ended up in this situation that she's in right now. So we're going to learn a little bit more about her, and this is, as it says in the second line here, it is said by Jordan Baker. So Jordan Baker is telling Nick this story. Remember that Jordan and Nick were supposed to go out for tea, so here it is. It says, one October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tut, 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 tut in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a little white roadster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night, anyways for an hour. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. "Oh, hello, Jordan," she called unexpectedly. "Please come here." I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the older girls I admired her the most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross and make bandages. I was. Well, then would I tell them that she couldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. His name was Jay Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. Okay, so real quickly, we've got Jay Gatsby as this lieutenant that's looking at Daisy the way that every girl wants to be looked at sometime. So we now know that Daisy and Gatsby have a history. And so it seems like they had kind of a lovey-dovey history or some sort of a dating history. So let's keep going here. It says, I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years, even after I'd met him on Long Island. I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. And after that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. Okay, these rumors suggest that her relationship with Gatsby, with this officer, was fairly serious, right? She wanted to go and see him off to war, but her family prevented her from doing so. Then she was not on speaking terms with her family because she was frustrated, right? And then after that, says she didn't play around with soldiers anymore. So her family basically said, nope, you're not going to be dating this guy anymore. And so that, made her feel sad. Okay. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut after the armistice, like a coming out party, like I'm ready to date now. And in February, she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Sealback Hotel, and the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. Even by our standards today, $350,000 is a lot, and imagine the inflation that would have taken place. So that necklace that Tom Buchanan gave her, as a wedding gift, that was worth a lot, okay? My question, and I have it kind of here over to the side, is what kinds of expectations come with a wedding gift of that size, right? You buy a wedding gift or a gift in general that is that expensive. What expectations come with that, right? What did Tom really feel like he was doing? And, is he just buying a nice present, or is he investing in a way? And how so? So something to think about. Okay. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed, as lovely as a June night in her flowered dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauterne in one hand and a letter in the other. "Congratulate me," she muttered. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it." "What's the matter, Daisy?" I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. "Here, dearies." She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em all Daisy's changed her mind. Say Daisy's changed her mind." She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it in the tub with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. One detail I find interesting is what she did with that 350,000 string of pearls is she threw them in the trash, right? So she had to pull the string of pearls out of the wastebasket. She threw those pearls away. And yet, there's some sort of letter, right? She wouldn't let go of a letter. She was in a bath, and holding on to this letter so much so that it crumbled to pieces, right? Got wet and it crumbled to pieces. She was holding tight onto that letter, right? This letter, compared to a string of pearls worth $350,000, that letter meant nothing. And yet, it must have meant everything to her because she's holding tightly to it. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress. And half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband, meaning crazy about him, not mad at her husband, but she was so in love with her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together, made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. This detail here says Tom got into a car accident and it got into the paper, right? So cool, interesting. The more interesting thing, though, was it says the girl who was with him. What that suggests is that there was a girl with him, meaning Tom, in the infancy of their marriage, was already cheating on Daisy, right? They got married in June. This is August. So 2 months into marriage and he's already cheating, right? So you can maybe, you can understand why Daisy would look around for Tom. Where's Tom? Where's Tom? Because perhaps she was already on edge that he was cheating on her. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes and later in Deauville, and then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation, perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for amour at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. Okay, so that's the end of Jordan's story. Let's take a look. When Jordan Baker, so now it's back to Nick's perspective. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep. This is a song, by the way, and it maybe even, like it says on the notes here, it maybe reflects Gatsby's desire to rekindle a romantic relationship with Daisy, right? That seems to be what was being hinted at in this little section. Okay. Nick says, it was a strange coincidence, I said. Well, but it was no coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. If you remember at the end of chapter 1, Nick comes home from Tom and Daisy's house. Remember at the very, very beginning, he comes home, and that's like the first time he actually sees Gatsby. He sees Gatsby reaching out over the water, and he said something about maybe there was a green light out there, right? So if he's reaching out over the water, now Nick is making the connection, oh, he was reaching out over the water because symbolically he was really reaching out towards Daisy, right? He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? Well, he's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? Oh, he wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh, I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me as his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. Oh, I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you're a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. All right, so a lot of pieces are coming together here. One question we maybe had as we were exploring his party in chapter 3 is, why is he throwing this party, inviting all of these people he doesn't know? Why is he doing all of this? Well, it turns out he's throwing these parties because he's hoping to attract Daisy to them so that he can then rekindle with her or reignite whatever was happening with her before. So he threw all those parties, not for all those random people, but he included those random people because he was hoping that in the crowd of random people that Daisy would walk in. Okay. Now, why doesn't he arrange a meeting somewhere else? Well, Jordan Baker says very specifically because he wants Daisy to see his house. So he's hoping to impress Daisy, right? He wants Daisy to see the grandness and the splendor of his house and the richness and all of that, right? He's hoping that his wealth will impress her. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. I love that Nick asked this question. Does she want to see Gatsby? Okay. Earlier, Nick mentioned that I can't believe, he's going to all this trouble just to ask such a little thing. He just wants me to invite her over for tea so that he could stop by. That seems like such a small thing. But it's not. It's asking a married woman to come over for tea so that another man, not her husband, can then, I don't know, try to win her heart back or something like that. So it's really not a simple request. So I think it's funny that even Nick said, well, it's just such a simple request. Okay, Nick, this guy who's supposed to be this man of integrity, this person of good morals, of good, wholesome background, and he's like, yeah, that's not a big deal at all. But it kind of is, right? But I do love that he asked this question, does she want to see Gatsby? Because that's kind of a good question, right? What if this is totally undesired on her end, right? All right, so she's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street, a block of delicate pale light, beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. All right, Nikki. Nikki got a kiss at the end, so good for him. But he says he's unlike Gatsby and Tom because he doesn't have a woman that he has to be secret about, right? Like, he doesn't have any secrets about this. Tom has a mistress that he kind of has to keep hush-hush, although he doesn't. And then there's Gatsby, who desires Daisy, who, again, that's kind of needs to be a secret. And Nick is like, yeah, I'm kind of glad I don't have a situation like that where I can simply enjoy the person who's next to me and I don't have to, it doesn't have to be some bad, underhanded thing. All right, that's chapter 4.